If you're watching this chapter, you've made it to the last chapter of this course. But seriously, if you're ready to think about expanding your business, you've reached a huge milestone in your career and you should be very proud. This chapter covers 5 potential routes of expansion and examines the advantages and disadvantages of each one. I'll also explain how we chose our own expansion path. Option 1, start a second food truck. Since you've built one already, the second time around will definitely be much easier.
Make it better, second time around.
You'll have all the proper connections with vendors, a food truck builder, accounting, legal, and so on. You may also be able to secure better financing terms this time around because you can use your first truck as leverage. There are a few disadvantages though. First of all, if you live in a small town or city, there may not be enough parking spots for your second truck to do as well as your first spot. Even in a huge, dense place like New York City, there are only a handful of prime spots that most food trucks congregate around. You also have to keep in mind that if 2 trucks park only a few blocks from each other, the sales of one truck will cannibalize the sales of the other. So don't expect your profits to double. A more realistic goal would be a 50% increase in profits and up to 70% on the high end. Another disadvantage is that until you find a driver for your new truck, you may have to go back to the grueling midnight work schedule of driving out and sleeping in the truck. Or if you've been leaving your truck unoccupied after parking, you could have your driver drive out the second truck immediately afterwards. But by that time, a lot more of the spots will be taken up by other trucks. Plus, you'll now be risking 2 trucks getting the permit scratched or getting broken into in the wee hours of the night. Option 2, franchise. If your truck has a line of customers every day, you'll eventually meet a few people who will ask if you're interested in franchising your business. In a franchise model, you, as a franchisor, allows an investor or a franchisee to build their own food truck, but you lend him your business name, your recipes, and your operational model. In return, the franchisee typically pays you a flat startup fee plus a percentage of all sales, usually around 7%. The franchisee also agrees to do business exactly like you do business, so he can't suddenly start selling a new burger if you haven't given approval for it. Before you start dreaming of becoming the next McDonald's, know that in order to even consider a franchise model, your entire business needs to be on the books. In other words, you can't be hiding any money from the IRS. Any decently smart investor will ask to see your finances, but if you can't back up your numbers with your actual business tax returns, your business is worth diddly squat. The risk with franchising is that you basically have to monitor your franchisee just as closely as you would monitor your own second truck. However, since the franchisee is technically the owner of that truck, you can't just go in there and micromanage him or his employees. And if you see that the franchisee is slacking on quality control or something else, it's not as simple as just firing him and finding a replacement. Depending on your contract, you'll most likely have to prove that the franchisee violated a specific clause in your franchise agreement before you can take direct action. Option 3, wholesale. If your food truck sells something that can be easily packaged and has a decent shelf life, you may want to consider wholesaling. Good candidates would be anyone selling baked goods, specialty drinks, sweets, snacks, or sauces. In a wholesale model, you agree to package and sell a bulk amount of your products to either a wholesale distributor or directly to a business like a grocery store or a cafe. Since it's wholesale, the amount you make per unit is less than what you make if you sold it directly from your truck. But you may end up with more money in the end because you can sell a lot more units in total. Besides higher revenues, wholesaling can grow your brand much more quickly, especially if you get into a national chain like Kroger, Publix, or Walmart. I already mentioned the first disadvantage of wholesaling, which is that you'll be making less money per unit sold. The second disadvantage is that you may need to invest a lot of money on packaging and design. Remember, when a customer comes to your food truck, there's a very high probability that they'll order something on your menu. On the other hand, if your food is one of 100 options in a supermarket aisle, unless your packaging stands out, there's little to no chance that your food will even catch people's attention. Even if you have beautiful packaging, people may still go with a different brand. Third, unless your food or drink naturally has a long shelf life, you may need to change the recipe and add some preservatives. This may alter the taste and texture of the final product in an undesirable way. Option 4, start a restaurant. If you can come up with the money, a restaurant is a great option for a successful food truck owner. It allows you to take advantage of the much bigger kitchen so that you do most of your food prep at the restaurant. It is generally a more stable source of income than a food truck because poor weather has less of an effect when a customer can sit and eat indoors. It also opens up more delivery and order ahead options since you'll have more staff that can handle the extra output. Finally, employees don't need a special license to work in a restaurant, at least in New York City. The biggest disadvantage is the huge startup cost. If you live in a major city, a restaurant in a busy downtown area can seem impossibly out of reach for the single reason. In Manhattan, for example, a small restaurant space, which is around 1,000 square feet with a basement, can rent for $15,000 to $20,000 a month in the busier neighborhoods. In fact, having $1 million in startup funds is actually pretty average, believe it or not. Another disadvantage is that there are so many more regulations for restaurants. You need to plan for things like handicapped bathrooms, maximum seating capacity, alcohol licenses, and so on. The last disadvantage is that many landlords will ask to see your business financials and your personal credit history before even considering letting you apply for their space. This is because they don't want to have to deal with the headache of evicting a tenant who's constantly behind on rent or just doesn't know how to operate his business successfully and goes broke in less than a year. This is the option we went with for several reasons. Around the end of our second year in business, our food truck was doing well. We had people line up at our truck 15 to 20 minutes before we even opened. We had a team of 6 full-time employees, and we were going through so much food that we rented a commercial kitchen. We also had a few investors ask about franchising, but we didn't want to give up that kind of control so early on. So naturally, we started thinking about a second truck, and this is when I brought up the idea of a restaurant to my partners for the following reasons. We had 2 major problems with our food truck. One was that since we wanted to do everything legally, we hired only people who had the proper food handler's license. Or we spent time helping new employees get the license before they joined us on the truck. This is extremely time consuming, and looking at the bigger picture, it didn't seem like a very scalable model. In other words, it would be tough to rapidly expand to a fleet of food trucks if it would take months to fully staff even one truck. Our second major problem was that we were paying over $1,000 a month for our commercial kitchen space because we needed the extra storage space and the extra cooking equipment. This was, of course, in addition to the money we paid for a commissary. If we added a second truck, our kitchen needs and costs would double. So I worked through the numbers and figured that if we opened a restaurant instead, we could eliminate the staffing problem because restaurant staff don't need any kind of license in New York, and we could eliminate the need to rent a commercial kitchen. Plus, we would be able to start doing food delivery, which is a request we would get at least once a day. The only hurdle was the huge startup cost. To make a long story short, we found the perfect space about a year after we started our search, and everything's been going well so far. I'll create a second course later on about how to start a restaurant, and I'll go into all the details of a restaurant journey there. Option 5, sell your business. Maybe you feel like you've had a good run and it's time to move on to something else in the food industry, or to change to a different field completely. Or maybe you've grown out of love with your food truck and want to pass it on to another owner. Whatever the reason may be, selling your food truck can be a good option. But keep your expectations grounded in reality. Most owners looking to sell their food truck business grossly overestimate what people are willing to pay for it. Anyway, you'll most likely fall into one of 2 groups. Number 1, your food truck does okay financially, but sales have more or less stagnated, which means they aren't growing. After you pay all your expenses, including your own salary, your truck nets less than $2,000 a month in a major city, or less than $1,000 in a smaller city or town. If this sounds like your truck, you're basically just selling a food truck management job. In other words, let's say you want to sell your food truck for $60,000, which is how much it cost you to get it off the ground. Your truck is netting $1,000 a month. If you pay yourself a $3,000 salary, whoever buys your truck will be making around $4,000 a month, or around $48,000 a year. That's barely more than a manager at McDonald's makes. The difference is that a manager at McDonald's doesn't need to pay $60,000 to get that job. In fact, he has to pay nothing. At McDonald's, he'll also get a 401k, life insurance, healthcare, and paid time off. Sure, you could argue that buying your food truck, there's a potential for the owner to make a lot more profit in the future when sales grow. But how do you expect to convince him when you haven't even been able to grow sales yourself? Anyway, the most you should expect to get is your original startup costs, and that would be extremely lucky. More realistically, you should discount your original startup costs by 30% or more. So if you spend $60,000 in the beginning, you may get a buyer at around $40,000 or less. If you don't get any buyers even after discounting by 50%, it may make more sense to try to sell the equipment and the truck separately. Number 2, your truck does very well and your sales are growing every year. You consistently serve 200 or more customers a day. After paying all your expenses, including your own salary, your truck nets at least $5,000 in a major city, or over $4,000 in a smaller city or town. If this sounds like your truck, congratulations, you have a legitimate business. If you're not in a rush, you should be able to sell your business for all of your original startup costs plus extra. The extra depends on how much actual profit you're generating. There are a lot of resources online for calculating your business's net worth, but these estimates are pretty worthless because they assume you have infinite time to wait for the perfect buyer. In reality, your business is only worth what someone is willing to pay for it at that time. So if you need to sell it in a month or 2, you might barely recoup your startup costs. But if you can wait a few months or even up to a year, you should be able to make a good amount of money on the sale. Note that in both scenarios, I'm assuming you can back up your sales with proper business tax returns. If you've been dealing mostly in cash and hiding revenues from the IRS, you better hope that the person buying your truck is okay continuing that way or doesn't know enough to check that information.